Our reason for coming together today this morning was the unveiling of the Strzelecki commemorative plaque, which you should be able to see behind me, if I'm not blocking out too much of it. The COVID stone is a struggle. To begin with, I'd like to also welcome the Narragansett elder, Uncle John Casey, to welcome us to this ancient land of his ancestors.
But a good one. Hello, how are we all going? My name is T.Kosciuszko. I am a descendant of the Narragansett Snow people. This is my wife, Mary. She is a descendant of the European mob, New Taree. Kajinakan Gondwana, welcome you all to Australia. Kajinakan Tumbarumba, Mother Earth is talking. Welcome to Tumbarumba. Kajinakan Ginamanamaji, welcome to our holy mountain, where for the last 4,000 years the Narragansett Snow people have been descending to the summit on the new moon in January.
It was fantastic. It's a lovely day, and I've always been interested in this expedition, and I was particularly interested when I read some of the information about it that talked about multiculturalism, and Australia is certainly a multicultural country. And I thought today I might just briefly give you an idea of my multiculturalism, which isn't very significant, but I'll still share it with you. My family mostly come from North European, but even though they were very close together, they were often in conflict for different areas. And I'll talk about my great-great-grandfathers. A great-grandfather that I share the name with, George Hayes, was a solicitor in Halesowen, which is in the Black Country, not far from Birmingham. He died when his son, my great-grandfather, was 1. My great-grandfather subsequently ran away from home when he was 14 from his stepfather and ended up in Australia, ended up in Auburn Valley, married a lady from there, and they moved to Taradale and ran a property there for bardwells, breeding horses. And he was schooled at Taradale and then eventually moved. Another great-grandfather was William Scott. Now he emigrated from Scotland in Paisley to the United States, ended up in Massachusetts, ended up in the engineers in the American Civil War on the Union side, and later moved to San Francisco and then to Australia, where he became a sub-inspector of police. So for 3 generations, the family stayed together just around here basically. Didn't move, didn't do much at all, farmed and the like. Shortly in the 1950s and 60s, when Australia opened up borders, a whole new group of people came in. So my brother and my sister, my brother married a girl from Abruzzo. My sister married a man from Hong Kong. Australia is just a melting pot of nationalities, customs and ideas.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we are commemorating the events from exactly 181 years ago, when on the 9th of March 1840 an exploration led by Paul Edmund Strzelecki, but indeed multicultural in its character, departed from Welleregang farther towards the Snowy Mountains for what is called Strzelecki Southern Expedition. It was only a couple of days later that the great Polish explorer identified, climbed and named the highest peak of Australia, Mount Kosciuszko. From that moment, Paweł Strzelecki and Mount Kosciuszko have assumed particular importance to all Poles and the whole Polish community in Australia in particular. They also carry a symbolic role in the history of Polish-Australian relations, connecting the two countries and bridging the traditional cultures of Australia's First Nations with its European and Polish heritage. About 3 weeks ago, I had an opportunity to visit Kosciuszko National Park in order to see the rehabilitation projects after the last season's devastating bushfires. Many of the projects were financed with funds from Poland, around $150,000 total. In total were collected in a fundraise organized by volunteer firefighters from a small village in the southern part of Poland, Poręba Zbytkowska, as well as donated by representatives of Polish community in Australia. The passion, commitment of ordinary Poles who didn't hesitate to offer support for Mount Kosciuszko and its beautiful and unique nature endangered by deadly fires correspond with the initiative of Australian politicians and the dedication of Australian children in 1940 to make the achievement of Great Pole memorable for future generations. Ladies and gentlemen, with his lifelong devotion to the universal human values, Paweł Strzelecki deserved and was rightly given a wider international recognition. It's not a coincidence that my colleague, Ambassador of Ireland, decided to join us today, for which I personally thank him. As Paul Strzelecki also went down in the history of Ireland during the Great Famine of the late 1840. I'm not going to elaborate more on this part of his biography. I will leave it to you, Brendan. Let me simply add that the President of Ireland, Michael Higgins, personally attended the opening of the exhibition devoted to Strzelecki in Dublin in 2019. I'm very pleased that with the support of our embassy, the exhibition is on view at today's event. Distinguished guests, let me conclude with expressing my personal gratitude to our hosts today, Mr. Mayor James Hayes, the whole Council of Snowy Valleys, Mr. John Casey and Lorna, Ernestyna and Andrzej, Vice President of Kościuszko Heritage, for setting this important project in motion, making it happen. I would also like to thank the New South Wales Government, New South Wales Parliament, and personally Mr. Justin Clancy and the Honourable Mark Banasiak for your present and official support extended to these commemorations. And once again, thank you, Ambassador, dear Brendan, for making it all the way from Canberra in recognition of Paul Strzelecki's importance for Irish people as well.
You see the photo, the beautiful event that we had down there, just a celebration, a bringing together of diverse peoples. And again, these flags standing here represent that as well. We've spoken, Uncle John, obviously, of the First Nations. It was also wonderful to have down there today proud people who are locals to the area in that sense, and again to hear the stories of what originally was owned by Sir John Hay, then bought by the Patton family, and a number of years of continuation of that Patton family in that regard, and a number of families who cherish that country. To the Polish people, and to hear that from you, Ambassador, about the $160,000 that the Polish community raised following the bushfires to go towards rehabilitation of Kosciuszko speaks of the passion and the commitment of the Polish people and the sense of connectedness that they have to this land as well, and to the Irish people as well. And as I reflect on James's comments about this drawing together that is multiculturalism, for me, the question that it poses is that when we are faced with that intersection, that intersecting of peoples, how is it that we respond to that? And I think, for me, that answer, we need look no further than this man here, Strzelecki, because there's two parts to his story that stands out for me. One is his intrepidness, his willingness to push himself and to give of his best. And if I refer back to the speech notes that I was given, there was a piece that spoke of after travelling up here to the Upper Murray, they returned, and on their return down through what was they named Gippsland after Gips, the Port Phillip Herald reports that the party was now in a deplorable condition, so exhausted as to be unable to cope with the difficulties which beset their progress. But the Count, being more inured to the fatigue and privations attendant, alone retained possession of his strength. And it talks of his intrepidness. So that is one part for us. But for me, the second part is this sense of compassion and empathy and humanity that he went on and displayed with his work during the Irish famine. And as I said, when we draw upon James's comments about what multiculturalism means, I feel that when we answer the question of how we are to respond at that intersection, at that meeting of peoples, we should do so with strength and with all our will and with our best efforts, but also with a sense of compassion and empathy. So for me, thank you for being here today. Ambassadors, thank you. As you, firstly, may you always feel welcome here, and we look forward to perhaps one day your family, your beautiful daughters being here as well, perhaps. And likewise, Brendan Carmen, as you take the next step in your journey, may you always carry a piece of Australia in your hearts, as you know from today that there are many people, many Australians who call or carry a piece of Poland or carry a piece of Ireland in their hearts as well. But may we all, as we go forward today, may we celebrate and honour this person, but more importantly, call to mind an intrepidness and also a willingness to always act with compassion and empathy whenever we are together in communities of diverse peoples.
In this exhibition, we're recognising a special Polish friend of the starving Irish, Paweł Edmund Strzelecki. Did I do okay? Pretty good. Oscar was coaching me. Sorry. One of the truly great humanitarians of the 19th century. This exhibition tells us the intriguing story of Strzelecki, an explorer and geologist by profession, but thanks to whose efforts up to 200,000 children, sorry, I'm emotionally even thinking of it, were saved from starvation during the Great Famine of 1840s Ireland. Of course, in the Irish language, the famine is referred to as an Gort de Mór, the Great Hunger, because as in many cases there was food available. It wasn't available to the poor and those in the regions that Strzelecki focused on. Many commentators believe that if the British government had reacted earlier and in a way more in keeping with Strzelecki's approach, and more decisively to avert the worst ravages of the famine, the death toll, which was 1 million, would have been significantly less, and it would have averted the departure of over 2.1 million who were forced to emigrate to the UK, Canada, the United States, on what were called the coffin ships, where some came here, obviously to Australia as well, including some of the antecedents of our distinguished guests. I'd like to quote from the speech of the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, when he opened the exhibition in May 2019 in Dublin. I quote the President: "On an occasion like today, in which we discover the detail of his heroic work and formally mark Polish links to the Great Famine in Ireland, it is important to recall that all those who suffered and perished during this most defining event in the making of contemporary Ireland. That catastrophe in terms of human impact was, as we now recognise, is true in all famines, ultimately political and economic in its origins. We are morally challenged to reject any suggestion that its human toll was unavoidable, inevitable, or indeed, as some sources would put it, an act of God. I think, therefore, Irish people, and if I can suggest maybe Polish people, there's an obligation on us to take a different approach to hunger and to understand it in a different way when it strikes other parts in the modern world, the current world, when we can make an input into that." Sorry, political statement over. Let me revert to the magnificent work of Paweł Strzelecki in helping to mitigate and avert an even greater loss of life than the horrendous death toll actually suffered. Strzelecki was the main agent of the British Relief Association, the largest private provider of hunger relief during Angorftamor, the Great Hunger. Strzelecki developed a visionary and effective mode of assistance, feeding starving Irish children through the schools. He extended daily food rations to school children across the most famine-stricken parts of the west of Ireland, while also distributing clothing and promoting basic hygiene. At its peak in 1848, around 200,000 children from all religious denominations were being fed, many of whom would have otherwise died from hunger and disease. Strzelecki remained in Ireland, assisting poor families until 1849, even though he himself was suffering from the effects of typhoid fever he contracted in Ireland. Strzelecki also helped impoverished Irish families to seek new lives here in Australia, whereas we know from the earlier unveiling by Ambassador Strzelecki, he was an explorer in the years prior to arriving in Ireland. His commitment was widely recognised and praised by his contemporaries. Therefore, it was appropriate that in May 2015, a plaque honouring Strzelecki's fantastic contribution was unveiled by the Lord Mayor of Dublin and the Mayor of Poznan on Sackville Street in the heart of Dublin City, which is directly across the street from the General Post Office, where our independence struggle began in 1916. So, end of my speech. On behalf of the people of Ireland and the Irish community in Australia, I wish to thank Ambassador Strzelecki, all involved in organising this, the elected representatives of the people, for Paweł Strzelecki's service to the Irish nation. And I wish this exhibition, which I now officially open, every success. Thanks everyone.
Tape, sorry, of course. Would you join me? Please. This should be a Polish-Irish joint position. I hope this works now.
Kosciuszko was never in Australia, but we are proud that both Strzelecki and Kosciuszko have withstood the tests of time. Both are remembered as friends of humanity. Both are remembered as great friends of indigenous people. We are proud that Strzelecki in his travels respected indigenous rights and customs, and that in his gold medal winning monograph, he wrote respectfully about indigenous Australian culture. Kosciuszko in his famous will left all his American assets to free and educate African American slaves. It is estimated that Strzelecki as a volunteer saved over 200,000 of Irish children from starvation in the Great Potato Famine. The exhibition unveiled today refers to these events. Let us recall why Mount Kosciuszko is so deeply valued also by Polish people. It was named in 1840, at a time when Poles had been dispossessed of their land, having been carved up by Russia and Austria, and 100 years later, a commemorative plaques, partly funded by school children of Australia, were unveiled on Mount Kosciuszko. At this time, newspapers across Australia were reporting that invading Germans during the Second World War were destroying Kosciuszko monuments in occupied Poland. The oppressor hated this word, synonym and symbol of liberty. At the unveiling ceremony of Australia's highest summit, each speaker pointed out that while tyrants were destroying Kosciuszko monuments in Poland, the school children of Australia were memorializing his name. Like many indigenous nations, people of Polish heritage know what it means to be erased from the map. From distant Australia, Mount Kosciuszko was telling the world that Poland would not vanish. We recognize the indigenous presence in Australia and in the region. With great empathy, we have befriended already the Monaron Galiko from the eastern part of Kosciuszko, where the monument of Strzelecki was unveiled in 1988. They took part in our celebrations, in Kosciuszko festivals, and we reciprocated in taking part in Night of Days and in other celebrations. We organized Polish Galiko fraternity flights over Mount Kosciuszko and are proud to have given Galiko elders the opportunity to view Mount Kosciuszko from above. On the bicentennial of Kosciuszko Days, we brought a group of Galiko elders and leaders to Poland to visit the famous symbolic tomb of Kosciuszko, the Kosciuszko Mound, so similar in profile to Australia's highest summit. We believe it was worthwhile for Aussie youth to discover the wonderful stories of two men behind the Mount Kosciuszko. We believe we have sparked interest in Strzelecki and Kosciuszko by organizing various school competitions. Still, on this side of the mountain, a new chapter is ahead of us.
Strzelecki, scientist, explorer, humanitarian. We've heard previous speakers talk about those aspects of the man. We've seen the exhibition around here which talks about that as well. My connection with Strzelecki goes back to 1984 when I was a student at the University of Wollongong. I was doing a science degree majoring in geology and I was tasked with mapping some land out at Bungonia, Marula, just north of Goulburn. And whilst I was doing that research, I came across the work of Strzelecki back in the late 1830s, early 1840s, and I came across this book. This is a copy of his book, Physical Description of New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land, published in London in 1845. Now, this is a very significant book in the history of Australian science because it's the first substantial scientific text about Australia. Within its 500 pages, it's got a wealth of information covering so many of the natural sciences: geology, mineralogy, paleontology, botany, meteorology, ethnography. Embryology is in here. It's quite an astounding document, and he compiled this document as a result of the work he did in the 4 years that he was here, between April 1839 and April of 1843. During that time, he walked over 7,000 miles. Now, for those of us who are worried about our health, that's 14 million steps. That's a lot of steps to do in 4 years. And he was very much someone who worked, he was doing his research, he was on the ground doing research. But he was also a very sociable person. He was able to communicate with all levels of science, of society. He worked with local Aboriginal people, with convicts, free settlers, officials, the military, the governors. Across the society, he was able to communicate and empathise with. And as a result, he was able to bring those people on board in instances where he needed help to achieve some of his goals. And I think the expedition to Melbourne, to the Gippsland, and the encounter with T.Kosciuszko, that was just one small element of the things he achieved during his lifetime. And this book is one major element of what he achieved during his lifetime. Following the publication of the book, he really didn't do much science after that. But as I said, it's a foundation document in Australian history. For example, it includes some of the first geological maps of Australia. It includes some of the early fossil descriptions, which can help us date our rocks and all that. And works such as this laid the foundation for the ongoing development of the country of Australia. He also raised issues such as he discussed his encounters with Aboriginal people. He also raised concerns about the fate of what was happening with the Aboriginal people. He talked about the environment, his concerns over deforestation. He talked about the weather. In this, he not only recorded information, data, but he also put forward his own views about a lot of these things. So it's a text that, and plus he also published other material, and it's a text that scientists will keep going back to. Researchers, young researchers, people such as myself doing university degrees, will keep going back to the work, the scientific work of Strzelecki. So, to many of us here, he's primarily remembered as, I know very little about his work outside of Australia, what he did before and after. But of his work here in Australia, he achieved a hell of a lot. He was, as I said, one of the most significant pioneering scientists, explorers and humanitarians to visit Australia. And he can rightly stand alongside T.Kosciuszko, both within his homeland and most especially within Australia, as a pole of distinction, for he is one of the foremost pioneering scientists and explorers of Australia since the arrival of Europeans in 1788. Thank you.